this episode of What's the Risk? In this episode, we will be talking about the Verkada Attack. So let's get started. The attack is against the cloud-based security surveillance solutions company called Verkada. They produce cameras, and this is what was hacked, their cameras. The production service was compromised in March of 2021, and the attackers gained privileged credentials to security cameras in many client facilities. The attackers gained access to customers' video and images, both live and archived, from more than 150,000 cameras. These cameras were located in schools, jails, hospitals, police stations, and a Tesla factory. A hacktivist group claimed responsibility for the attack, but as we'll see as we get further into this, there's a little more to the story than just that. This is a depiction from the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA report that shows how the attack occurred. In this image, at the top, we have the attacker. At the bottom left, we have the customer site with the camera. And kind of in the middle and to the bottom right, we have the Verkada network depicted. And so in step one, the customer has the camera in their facility and it sends a data feed to the Verkada infrastructure stored on databases and managed remotely. In step two, the attacker was able to access this management platform with super admin privileges. And in step three, the attacker was able to get videos, including archived videos and snapshots. So when I first saw this attack, it really was an eye-opener for just how monitored we are in today's society. Many organizations have cameras inside their facilities and their offices, and many of us have these kinds of cameras in our homes for security purposes. When we're gone, we will have these kinds of cameras for monitoring purposes. They're all IP-based cameras. And so this really, I thought, was a good example to talk about as not only how exposed we might be, how heavily we are monitored in this society, but also opening up this discussion about the Internet of Things and what that security means and what happens when a breach like this occurs and how wide the impact is. So a hacker, Tilly Cotman, part of an international hacker collective, claimed credit for this as well as hacking Intel and Nissan. This was reported by Bloomberg. And in that report, Tilly was quoted as saying, "It's just too much fun not to do it." If you get a chance, I would recommend to read up on some of this. I thought it was interesting how cavalier the attitude was when they found these credentials for making them public. Verkada's CIO and an international team worked with, and the internal team worked with an external security firm to investigate the incident. And this is all kudos to Verkada for their response in handling this. They were open, responsive. The company worked to notify customers, and they set up a support line for questions. All best practice in handling this type of an incident or any incident. Now let's consider some of the factors that led up to this attack. In October of 2020, Verkada fired 3 employees after reports surfaced that workers took pictures of female colleagues. This I consider a precursor event. Without mature security practices, we can expect continued abuse. So when we start talking about quantifying the risk, and we will do this for this example, knowing that an incident occurred previously, like this one in 2020, where employees were abusing the access that they had, as we quantify the risk, we can consider this a precursor event. The root cause here was a lack of mature security practices. And we can dive into exactly which practices were missing, but that's the root cause, is policies and procedures part of that mature security practice. And now let's see what some of the other things that happened. So hackers shared the material with the Washington Post to highlight concerns over widespread surveillance that the public is subjected to and near constant. There are more than 24,000 organizations named in this material that was given by the hackers to the Washington Post. Some videos were actually films from inside people's homes. That's how pervasive this is. We also learned that engineers and support staff had admin access so they could address technical issues, which on the surface sounds completely logical and to be expected. The problem is these internal controls were not strong enough to protect the client's data. So when we look at this and we see engineers, multiple, and support staff, not necessarily administrators, had access, we begin to see some of what the internal issues were, some of the lack in the maturity practices. Too many people having unsupervised access. Verkada attacked and demeaned one of its competitors, a cybersecurity, stating their protocol was, quote, one of the most dangerous in the cyber community. Again, on its surface, who knows if this was valid or not, but being seen as an organization attacking their competitors, then when something happens like this can be used to put them in a bad light, and it was used this way. Often, corporate or employee statements can cause reputational damage. So what we're seeing here is beginning to enumerate what were some of the impacts from this breach. And this is one of the impacts that came out because this was reported about this prior statement when the attack happened. And so this was then used to put them in a bad light because they had demeaned a competitor's cybersecurity and now they got hacked. And so you can see how this played out in the media. So now let's talk about what was some of the impact from this attack. So first, this attack impacted a cross-section of American institutions from schools, hospitals, jails, offices, banks, health clinics, just as a data breach. If we look at this just as a data breach, and I actually struggled with how to classify this because it falls into multiple categories. So just as a data breach, we see that one vendor, one supplier's breach, even though this was not the typical data you would think of being exfiltrated out of an organization, these cameras were focused on a wide variety of spaces and activities inside these organizations. So in offices, the work people were doing, screens and so forth. In banks, the same situation. In health clinics, private, HIPAA compliant data was being played out on the screen, and in hospitals and in schools. So it was a wide variety of what was being shown on the screens, access in and out of facilities, who came, when they left. This was just a great deal of data in video format. We normally think of these things as being databases that are breached, going after credentials or financial data. This was video, but still it contained a wide swath of what we would normally report and think of as a data breach. The fact that it was video feed doesn't really change. This was a far-reaching data breach. The hacker group was able to hijack controls to launch further attacks based on video content. So now we're seeing that this is a supply chain attack. So not only was it a data breach, it's a supply chain. So they were able to take control with the super admin privileges of that management console. That's the remote access to manage these cameras. From there, they had full control. They could grab access to all the data, including all the historical data and snapshots. And now they were in a position, if they had decided to do this, to launch further attacks. IPVM, an authority on video surveillance, reported that the credentials may have been leaked by a disgruntled employee. This makes this an insider threat. So if we look back to and recall the incident that they had in 2020, where privileges were abused by employees, that was a precursor event. Controls were not sufficiently tightened or put in place. And then this event appears, as reported by IPVM, to have been precipitated, leaked by a disgruntled employee. Insider threat programs are so important to organizations. To have awareness training to know what signs to look for an insider threat. And generally, there are always signs that were there before whatever the bad event is. In this case, you have a disgruntled employee who has access. So this could have been dealt with if they had had that kind of program and awareness in place, which they did not. Firedome reported that Verkada had no idea they had been breached until the video feed hit Twitter. Two things about this statement in the media and the fact that this is how it occurred. Not knowing that you have a deep breach is not uncommon. Advanced persistent threats work this way. This was not an advanced persistent threat. But it is not uncommon, and it has not been uncommon for companies of all maturity security practice levels to get hit with attacks that exist and persist within their organization for quite some time until they're actually identified, and then something can be done about it. And it is often a third party that's aware of this before the organization is aware. The fact that this hit Twitter in a video feed, again, this hacker's intent, this collective's intent, was to publicize this. That's why they put it out in video feed. That's why they had it hit Twitter. That's why they took it to the Washington Post. That was their goal in this attack. So the impact from this goes to reputation. The way that they did this was purposeful, intending to make a point, and they did this at Furcata's expense. Furcata security was limited in scope, with no solution for preventing, detecting, or mitigating against attacks against the central management console. It just was not something that they had built into their policies and procedures. This speaks to my earlier comment about the level of maturity in the security practices. However, I would encourage every organization to pause and go back to your organizations and take a look at what your remote access looks like. So it is very common, and with good reason, for organizations to allow remote access. The questions you should be asking are, what is the security around that endpoint that is remote access in? That should be an organizationally owned and controlled asset. And what is the encryption around that communication? And what is the security stack that you are going through in that remote communication into the organization? And then looking at what are the controls and what you have in place. Would you be able to detect or prevent or mitigate against attacks from remote management? This can be an overlooked area. Let's talk about lessons learned. The super admin privileges are generally a bad idea. It is much better if you grant access, administrative access as well, on a role-based schema. In other words, you limit the number of people that have administrative privileges, and you also should apply least privileges. In other words, only give them access to the things that they actually need to have access to do their job. Now, this would mean that an administrator would use administrative credentials to do that work, and then they would use their personal account credentials to do their normal daily reading their emails, producing their reports, and those sorts of things. And often, organizations will find that administrators don't like this extra switching between their accounts, but too bad. There's too much risk around allowing super admin privileges to be at play throughout the day when an individual is doing things like reading email, browsing the internet. All of those activities need to be done under a typical user account construct, which should be restricted in its access. Giving admin access to too many people with too many privileges can lead to abuse of privileges. And that was the scenario that we saw in 2020. And that's why I keep looking and pointing back to that and saying this was the precursor event. But because the precursor was not prevented, it occurred again. That abuse of privileges occurred again. This speaks to oversight and management policy and procedures. So having a good process for oversight and having procedures that are implemented are how you begin to resolve this problem. The disgruntled employees with admin privileges are always a high risk. And this speaks to the insider threat program that every organization should have. And this will include HR policies and procedures. Beginning with training, how does someone know to identify indicators of an insider threat? What do they do if they think someone might be in a position to become an insider threat or abuse privileges? How does HR respond to this? How does management respond to this? All of these need to be formalized, and all employees should then be aware, beginning with the awareness training and then understanding what consequences might be. Furcata took a hit to the reputation from the hack, as well as reports of employees abusing privileges. So this is the impact to reputation, and it was from two directions. The hack itself was a hit to reputation, but then as the reports came out about employees abusing privileges and it possibly being disgruntled employees, that also was an impact to reputation. The Verge reported that a former employee had stated, and I quote, "Nobody cared about checking the logs." So here we're seeing that there apparently was no formal process for accessing the footage. So a moment ago, I talked about the need for a formal process and oversight and management, and this would be part of that process. Having a formal process for a request and approval for accessing footage, and then having that logged, and then having that log reviewed periodically. It's kind of like in the military, there's a two-man rule for things. It's kind of like having a two-man rule. When you have sensitive data, that's actually a very good idea. Now let's discuss some of the best practices that we can consider putting in place to avoid this kind of attack. The inventory policies, you should inventory policies and procedures, especially around the oversight and management related to client data. And this speaks to having mature security practices. So going back to your organizations, looking at your policies and procedures and really asking yourself, do we have what we need? And I know that most people will go through this exercise and say, yes, we have what we need, but I would question that. If you don't have a specific policy, process, and procedure for access, management, logging it, that two-man rule, then you probably really don't have everything you need. Allow access based on the role and limit that access. This is the role-based access. This is a best practice. And then along with that, you have to have the logging. It should be a formal process for data access, and all activity is logged. Anytime you have very highly sensitive information, this is what you should be doing. You should have a formal procedure, including the access request and approval. That's your oversight and management piece. Limit and control remote access. This may sound obvious, but I suspect that many organizations have a little too liberal access in this area. And that's because organizations and administrators will say, hey, if something happens, I need to be able to get in really quick so that I can respond quickly and you can avoid the drive time. And that's legitimate, but as long as it is tightly controlled and limited, then you won't have as much problem. And this leads you to this idea of a zero trust architecture, making sure that you can verify what asset is making a request to another asset. Have an insider threat program. Train regularly on signs of insider threat. In the military, this is a common theme, and in the government as well, this is a common theme, and the awareness training is there, but I don't know that organizations outside of that really pay that much attention to this. And this is a perfect example of why they should pay attention to this. An insider threat is usually someone that is under some duress. It can be financial situation. It can be stress within their family, marital problems. Someone in the family is sick. They're going through some sort of turmoil. These things put pressure on people. And when we are under pressure, we as human beings might not make the best decisions. And this is where the insider threat comes from. Someone is under stress and may make a bad decision, a decision that they would not make otherwise. And so when we know that people are under duress, this is when we need to pay more attention. Have an outreach program in your organization to make sure that they have what they need or they can get access to programs that can assist them. Having an open dialogue is very important. Even going so far as relieving some duties so that they don't have to deal with that much more stress. All of these things are helpful and give you more insight into what's going on. Now let's talk about quantifying the risk. These are the 5 steps I would suggest for analyzing this particular attack. I would start with number 1, identify the factors for consideration. In other words, what are the things we are going to consider in our analysis, and what are those things that we are not going to include? And when you do your analysis, you will write these up and include them when you deliver the analysis so that it's very clear what was part of the analysis and what was excluded. Step number 2, I would estimate the weakness for each of these factors. Number 3, I would then estimate the probability for each of these factors. Number 4, I would calculate the risk. And then number 5, and this is the step that most people skip, but it's the most important. Define the impact. Decisions are made once management knows what the impact is. You can't make a decision until you know what the impact is. So let's step through these. Some of the factors I would consider we have just discussed. Role-based access. Do you have it? Do you not have it? How consistently is it applied? Right? Ask yourself all these questions. Secondly, I would consider least privileges. Even though we might have had a role-based access, if the privileges were too far-reaching for that role, that's just as bad, right? Both of those equally can put a situation where there's too much access and too much can be done. And then I would look at a formal request and approval process. Do you have such a process? Is it being enforced? When was the last time the logs were reviewed? The fact that you have a process, if it's not being followed, doesn't really matter. So you have to not only say, do I have the process? Do I have a procedure? Is it being implemented? And then finally, when was the last time we went back and reviewed it to see how effective it was? And that's always one of the most important steps because that's where you can fine-tune and tweak and improve a process. So having considered the factors, I would then turn around and look at the architecture. Restricted and controlled remote access. What does it look like? What are the components? How are these assets communicating with each other? And where is the weakness in my architecture? I would add that to my list. I would also have as a factor an insider threat program. Is there awareness training? Yes or no? Does it include the signs of an insider threat? Do you have a fully formed program around this? And then I would look back and ask, was there any occurrence of an event without mitigation increases its probability. Was there or have you experienced a precursor event? Because if there was a precursor event, then the probability that we're going to estimate must be increased. If there isn't, mitigation applied. If there was a precursor event and proper mitigations were applied, that's different. The question here is, did you experience in your organization a precursor event where mitigation wasn't properly applied? In this chart, I have a table listing some of the factors I've just described. In this case, I'm describing each factor as a percentage of being not completed or not complained. So admin console controls, I said, in this case, I'm going to estimate 60%. In other words, 60% is lacking. It's only 40% applied. So I'm saying my weakness in this area is 60%. Does that make sense? And then I've done this for least privileges, the insider threat, and oversight and management. Again, the percentages here, I'm estimating what's my weakness, what's my vulnerability, what's my exposure, right? Not my strength. Then once we have these estimated, we can chart what that exposure, what that weakness looks like, and what's the range of weakness that we're describing. And this begins to help drive conversations as we move forward with our analysis. Once that's done, then I would go to the calculation of risk. In the calculation of risk, this is a Bayesian joint probability. It's a straightforward mathematical calculation. You can do this for each factor, and then you can do it for its totality. And the formula for risk is threat or weakness times the likelihood or the probability equals risk. Well, that concludes this episode. I hope you have enjoyed it, and come visit us over at physmax.com for more things all about quantifying cyber risk.